Mayad gid nga aga sa akon Malitbog National High School family. To Mrs. Jocelyn A. Solmayor, our head teacher 1, Mr. Freddie F. Fadrigo, master teacher 2, Mr. Rinaldo S. Palmes, master teacher 1, Mr. Bjorn Red G. Paragados, master teacher 1. To Mr. Gary C. Arsenio, our planning officer, Mr. Jos Carpi de la Cruz, TEA president. To Mrs. Marjorie C. Paragados, our school IPEd focal person. To one and all, sa liwat, may ayad gid nga aga, kag welcome to our school-based IPEd retooling activity. This activity is very relevant and very important considering that Malitbog National High School is one of the IPEd or Indigenous Peoples Education implementing schools in the schools division of Iloilo. The first step in the implementation of this program is to introduce the program to the school, to the community, and to capacitate the teachers because they are considered as the program handlers and program implementers. Why the IPEd program is very significant to Malitbog National High School. Based on our data management, we have a considerable number of indigenous peoples or indigenous learners in our school. Therefore, there is a need for us to implement this program to cater to the needs, specific needs of our indigenous learners. The second basic question is that, do we still need to implement the program to our non-IP learners? The answer is yes. We need to advocate the program. We need to implement the program not only for our indigenous learners, but also to our non-indigenous learners so that we could raise awareness, we could promote multiculturalism, and to promote understanding despite cultural diversity. My talk this morning will be on the facts or the frequently asked questions about IPEd. The PowerPoint I am using as my reference was prepared by Mrs. Feli P. Aranya and Dr. Kent Verhel J. Castigador. Mrs. Aranya and Dr. Castigador are the district IPEd focal persons in the district of Alimujan 1 and Kalinog 1 respectively. And so what are the frequently asked questions about IPEd? First is, who are indigenous peoples in the Philippine context? Indigenous peoples or the indigenous cultural communities in the Philippines are cultural communities that have in varying degrees maintained until today the way of life, their customary governance systems, their indigenous knowledge systems and practices that we call IKSPs, and even spiritual traditions which have been practiced and passed on from one generation to another since the pre-Hispanic times or since the pre-colonization times. They also remember as a community the specific geographical area in the country which has been the home of their community since time immemorial. This geographical area is what we call their ancestral domain or their ancestral land. There are more than 100 cultural communities in the country that are considered IPs or ICCs. The term indigenous peoples can be used to refer to a person, example, IP learner, or to the cultural community as a whole, example, Panay Bukidnon of the Panay Island or Aita in Zambales. It can also be used as a general term when pertaining to a group of people who are of various IP ethnicities. In the Panay Island and in our municipality, there are only two recognized IPs or ICCs, the Panay Bukidnon and the Ati. And in our school, as far as I'm concerned, we have only one indigenous peoples group or one ICCs, and that is the Panay Bukidnon. At the community level, there are various terms encountered that pertain to IP groups in particular regions. In Mindanao, the term lumad has been popularized as a general term for cultural communities that are considered IPs. Please take note, lumad is not the name of the group or ethnicity. The ethnicity is the specific name of the group. For example, Taga-Kaulo or Blaan. In Filipino-speaking areas, the term Katutubo is the equivalent of lumad. Again, Katutubo is not the ethnicity. In our own context, in our own communities, we use the term Tumandok. But again, Tumandok is not the name of the IP group or the indigenous cultural community. We call ourselves Panay Bukidnon. What is IPEd program? The Indigenous Peoples Education or IPEd is the Department of Education's response to the rights of IPs to basic education, which is appropriate to their context, an education that respects their identities and promotes their indigenous knowledge, systems and practices, and other aspects of their cultural heritage. The IPEd program is not a separate program. It is a program that is a special program that is expected to interface with a regular program. It is an integrated program. That is why every teacher with an IP learner is expected to implement the program. The required number of IP learner in a school or in a class is only one. So if you have recorded one IP learner in your section or in our school, we need to implement the program in order to respond to that need of one IP learner. But considering that we have a considerable number of IP learners in our school, we are encouraged to implement the program and make it well integrated in the regular curriculum. Since our IP learners are not separated, they are being included in the mainstream or in the regular program. Therefore, we need to implement the IPEd with the IP learners and the non-IP learners, and it requires some creativity. It requires some resourcefulness on the part of the teacher on how to cater these two kinds of learners, the IP and the non-IPs. But in our own case in the municipality of Kalinog, it is not an issue whether you are an IP or a non-IP, because historically speaking, we all have our indigenous roots and identities, and we are very aware that we are one Kalinog. We belong to the same, more or less the same ancestry, if we are all Tumandok, and we are proud of our own culture and traditions. What are the objectives of the IPEd? The IPEd program aims to implement an enhanced basic curriculum that is culture sensitive and responsive to the indigenous communities. Specifically, the program aims to 1. Make curriculum culturally responsive to the community context of learners. 2. Build the capacity of teachers, school heads, and the concerned personnel at different levels of governance in implementing culture-based education for IP learners. And this is what we are going right now, to retool and to recapacitate all of you regarding our connection with our own communities and our own culture through this school-based retooling and capability building. 3. Support the development of culturally appropriate learning resources and learning environment responsive to the community context of learners. All these are contained in the IPEd issuances. The IPEd aims, as well as other concerns and important information about the IPEd program. So we have to get hold of the following IPEd memoranda for us to review about the IPEd program. We have IPEd Order number 62, series of 2011, titled Adopting the National Indigenous Peoples Education Policy Framework. Again, IPEd Order number 62, series of 2011. Another is IPEd Order number 103, series of 2011, or the creation of Indigenous Peoples Education Office, or the EPSEO. EPSEO is our main office in the IPEd Central, taking good care of the IPEd program implementation. Third is IPEd Order number 51, series of 2014, titled Guidelines on the Conduct of Activities and the Use of Materials Involving Aspects of Indigenous Peoples' Culture. This IPEd Order is, the discussion of this IPEd Order is being included in our discussion today, and one resource person will take good care of discussing this IPEd Order number 51, series of 2014, on guidelines in conducting activities related to culture and the use of materials involving the different aspects of indigenous people's culture. It is very important that we take extra care in publishing, for example, and posting aspects of culture, because there are some aspects of culture that are considered sacred and not supposed to be shared outside the community. DepEd Order number 32 series of 2015 is an issuance on adopting the Indigenous Peoples Education Curriculum Framework, and this will be highlighted in one of the talks in our today's retooling. Another issuance is DepEd Order number 22 series of 2016 on implementing guidelines on the allocation and utilization of Indigenous Peoples Education Program Support Fund. So this talks about the fiscal aspect of the IPEd implementation, where budget is being allocated to all divisions that are being downloaded to divisions, and this is being managed by the division IPEd focal person. Next is DepEd Order number 33 series of 2017 that talks about the roles and responsibilities of Indigenous Peoples Education focal persons at the regional, division, and school levels. DepEd Order number 34 series of 2017 guidelines on the formation of consultative and advocacy and advisory bodies of Indigenous Peoples Education in regions implementing the IPEd program, or we call it CAB, or the consultative and advisory body. In our case, at our level in our school, we call them IP community representatives. DepEd Memo number 128 series of 2018 titled Observance of the National Indigenous Peoples Day and Indigenous Peoples Month is our guide in conducting the IP Day and the IP Month that happens in August and in October respectively. And we are expecting that our focal person will have an early planning regarding the conduct of our of these two important celebrations regarding the indigenous peoples. So that is a challenge to our IPEd focal person and how we could really revitalize the conduct of activities related to the Indigenous Peoples Education Program. Next, essential question. Are we focused only on the indigenization of the indigenous knowledge systems and practices? The answer is no. We are mindful of the DepEd and IP competencies. What is highlighted is the context of the IP community as the setting and anchorage of the DepEd competencies. So we are going to make it clear that when we contextualize and indigenize, we are still guided by our milk in this time of the pandemic, or the most essential learning competencies. And all we have to do in the integration of the indigenous knowledge systems and practices is to indigenize these most essential learning competencies so that we could incorporate or integrate indigenous knowledge systems and practices. And I'm very glad that when we had our consultation with the National Commission on Indigenous Peoples regions, Region 6, 7, and 8, that our NCIP lawyers were very open to help us regarding the legalities of integrating IKSPs, because it's not that easy to integrate IKSPs into the curriculum, and it has been a long discussion. But the most important thing is that we have the blessing and we have the consent of our community elders. Therefore, it is very significant for us, very important for us to always coordinate with our community leaders, community elders, and that is the role of our school indigenous peoples education focal person, to coordinate with our indigenous cultural communities through their indigenous cultural leaders and elders, so that we could always ask about their suggestions, their wisdom, and their guidance in the implementation of the IPEd program, because they are our major partner in educating our indigenous peoples learners, or our IP learners. We are going to request the list of our community leaders here in our area. Most of our IP communities are found in the hinterlands of the Paz area, and also the mountainous areas of Kalinog. Frequently asked question is also on how a non-IP teacher effectively teach or use the contextualized curriculum. Is a non-IP teacher also a part of the IPEd program? The answer is yes. A non-IP teacher can effectively teach or use the contextualized curriculum, provided that he or she has undergone capacity building or capability building or retooling or a seminar or a training on IPEd implementation. As long as he or she knows the language, in the high school we don't teach using the mother tongue. Therefore, all we have to do is to integrate the indigenous knowledge systems and practices using the medium of instruction, English and Filipino in our own case. But of course, we could always code switch, because there are terms in our culture, in our own context, that could not be translated into Filipino or English, because the essence or the meaning might change. If you are familiar with and is living or practicing the culture and traditions or IKSPs of the IP, I think the most important thing is that we are always willing, we are always open to learn. And if we are catering indigenous learners, therefore we consider ourselves as insiders. We have been witnesses to the different wisdom, knowledge, and traditions of our communities, and we could make use of this knowledge in catering to our IP learners, because we could always integrate this in our lessons. If we are oriented with appropriate teaching strategies and approaches in using the contextualized curriculum, then we could have an edge on how we could implement the indigenous peoples education program. From whom can a teacher directly seek assistance on the contextualized curriculum? The teacher can directly seek assistance from his or her school head or trained peers, depending on whoever is more accessible. As your IPEd focal person in the division of Iloilo, I could always give you technical assistance and could help you in designing your learning activity sheets, for example, or your lesson exemplars on the integration of the IKSPs. There are a lot of initiatives and activities of our IPEd program in the division that we would like to introduce to you, and we would always be very happy to welcome you all to be part of these programs and activities. I think it takes your willingness, your dedication, and commitment to be an active part and an active implementer of the IPEd program. It is more on knowing ourselves, who we are as a person, and how connected are we to our communities, to our own culture and traditions. By knowing more about ourselves, the people in our family, in our communities, then we could open our eyes and our hearts to a lot of opportunities and possibilities of including the indigenous knowledge systems and practices in our teaching. Are teachers allowed to modify contextualized materials based on their knowledge and experiences? In the case that the exemplar was made or was developed by another teacher, the answer is yes, provided that there is pre-consultation and proper coordination with the community elders and or the culture masters, and in the case that the exemplar you are using is not your own, so it's very important to consult with the concerned writer or developer. We are warned to make sure of the things we teach about culture, because we might provide the wrong information, or we might misappropriate information about culture. That's culture misappropriation. How is contextualized curriculum utilized in multicultural schools? To what extent is the contextualized curriculum utilized in multicultural classes? It's in our own case, in our own setting, it's not that a big issue when we talk about multiculturalism or multicultural classes, since we are only catering one ICCs as far as I'm concerned, and that is the Panay Bukidnon. But in the case that we have multicultural classes, when majority of the learners in multicultural classes are IPs, then the contextualized curriculum should be fully utilized. In the case where half of the classes are non-IPs, there is still a need to use the contextualized curriculum so that the non-IP learners will appreciate the IP way of life, and that is our own advocacy also, to make them understand, and using contextualized lessons to both IP and non-IP would result to understanding with each other's cultural background, and that would also promote respect for one's culture and cultural diversity. Nevertheless, the contextualized curriculum is not used when majority of the learners are non-IPs. The answer is no, because even though we have only one IP learner in our section or in our class, we are still obliged to use exemplars or culture-based lessons in order to cater to the needs of our IP learner. In our case at Malitbog National High School, there is a need for us to contextualize and indigenize our lessons, for us to cater to the needs of our learners whom we consider very connected and very rooted, because they are representing indigenous cultural communities of Tapaz and Kalinog and Bingawan. So there is a need, and it is already our mandate to contextualize and indigenize our lessons. How does IPEd continue in this time of the pandemic? We have already talked about how learning continuity is implemented in this time of the pandemic, and we do not only resolve or resort to using downloaded materials from the central office and the regional office, but as our mandate also, and as our role as IPEd program handler and implementer, we need to provide additional materials for our learners, and that is why we'll have our revisiting and our workshop of the learning activity sheets that are contextualized and indigenized, and that would happen this afternoon. We need to go back to the last that we have started, and let us see with the help of our quality assurance team on how we could improve and make it more appropriate and culture based, so that this could be used in the field. This could be used by our IP learners. What is ethnicity? Ethnicity refers to the learner's cultural background and roots, largely based on ancestry like parents, grandparents, and shared cultural upbringing. Our ethnicity is our cultural community. In our case, we are called the Panay Bukidnon. And how are we considered as an IP? An IP is always considered by blood and not by affiliation. So if one or two of your parents are IP, automatically you will be considered as an IP, because you inherit you're being an IP from the both parents or from either of the parents. But once a non-IP gets married with an IP, it does not mean that he or she will become an IP, because it is not through affiliation but by blood. Why is it important to be accurate regarding ethnicity data on IP learners? Our IPEd focal person, school IPEd focal person, is in charge of our data management, in preparing an inventory of our IP learners, and with the help of the advisors, she could come up with an accurate data. It is very important that we prepare and we provide appropriate data on ethnicity, because that is the basic right of our IP learners to be recognized. Every child has the right to an identity and nationality. The correct recording of one's ethnicity is a must and a fundamental aspect of a learner's identity. It has a bearing on program implementation and the design of the teaching-learning process, because lessons can be developed in relation to the socio-cultural background of our learners. What if we have IP learners who would not accept that they are IP learners? Shall we record them in our database? The information should come from the parents and from the community leaders. So once we are sure that they are from IP parents, automatically we will include them in our list of IP learners. There are also students or learners who are not sure whether they are IP or non-IP, and how do we record them in our list? Again, we go back to their parents, we go back to the community leaders who could validate their ancestry. Is it DepEd who identifies who are IPs? It is the right of the IP learners and the IP communities to identity and declare who is an IP, while it is the obligation of DepEd to record it accurately in relation to its education mandate. DepEd personnel or DepEd teachers should not decide on who are to be considered IP learners, even if based on data of other agencies. The data of other agencies shall be considered only a secondary reference, while the ascription of the learner himself or herself and the description of the parents and the community is the primary source of information. But there are cases that parents would not allow or would not consider themselves as IP, so we always respect the decision of the parents. If they will not signify that they are IP, that they belong to the IP community, then we could not record it in our own, we could not include them in our record. But it is our mandate again, it is our mandate, it is our role, it is our advocacy to discuss this, to enlighten the parents about ethnicity, about there being an IP. How could we help them enlighten? How could we help them understand why they need to trace their own ancestry and to embrace there being an IP? As part of our advocacy, we need also to tell them that that is their basic right, that they have their bundles of rights, and they have also privileges. The government is always giving priority to our indigenous peoples because through the years they are considered as one of the most excluded sectors of the community. Does IP mean indigent person or indigent pupil? Because we would always hear from others that IPs are also for peace. The answer is no. The category of IPs is not synonymous with for peace, because IP stands for indigenous peoples and not indigent persons or indigent persons. For peace are not IPs. Not all for peace are IPs, and not all IPs are for peace, because the consideration in identifying our IP learners is by blood, while for peace is identified through economic status. Can language be used as a reliable basis for determining if the learner is an IP? Excuse me for a while. The answer is no. It is possible for an IP learner not to speak the language of the IP community one belongs to due to circumstances, because there are some cases when they would transfer to another place and the children could no longer speak their native tongue. Therefore, the language is not, the ability to be able to speak the language is not primary consideration in identifying who is an IP and who is not an IP. Not speaking the community's language does not mean that the IP learner is not an IP anymore, because when we talk about IP, that is status by blood, and wherever you will be, you are always considered an IP. How can we ascertain the IP identity of a learner? Before ascertaining if there are IP learners in the school or classes, It will be useful to know if there are cases of bullying or discrimination against IPs in the school or wider community. If there are such cases, it is possible that some learners, including their parents, will hesitate to reveal their ethnic identity, identifying as Ilocano or Bisaya or Boki or Bukidnon instead of their own cultural group. In such cases, determining ethnicity will have to be done in a sensitive manner. In our own case, I think we are already trying to overcome marginalization or discrimination against the IP in our area because because of the programs, advocacy programs on the promotion of IP rights, our IP communities become more and more empowered. But there are also communities that still need our help because they still need to send their children to school, and that is our role as IPEd program handlers. Our major concern is how to encourage our out-of-school youth, especially the IP youth, to go back to school so that we could help them transform their communities through education, create community leaders in the future, or to create responsible members of the family, of the community. How can we ascertain IP identity of a learner? Whatever the situation, it is useful to seek out the assistance of recognized community elders or leaders in the process of ascertaining who are IPs and who are non-IPs. As stated in the EPRA, a person may identify to being an IP, and that is what we call self-ascription. That is their basic right, not to ascertain their being an IP. But it has to be checked. It has to be validated with the community, and that is ascription by others. Since being an IP means having parents and other relatives in that particular cultural group. So kung naghalin kita sa kamalaman kang mga IP, automatically IP man kita. Kag kung kita nag-aako nga IP, that is our basic right and no one can question that. But the second stage of that is validation. So that is what we are doing when we would like to claim our certificate of confirmation. The National Commission on Indigenous Peoples is only facilitating. They are only confirming through validation and through ascription. First by the person and second by the community. So kung dapat kung gusto mo nga magpa-recognize ikaw nga IP ikaw, kilala ikaw sa community, kabuhi mo ang inyong pagka-IP dyan sa imong tagipusoon, kag hindi lamang bangod nga ikaw mag-apply sa obra or bangod ikaw may opportunity kag amo pa lang kagin declare mo ang imo nga pagka-IP. Kung sa bagay hindi natin man mabasol ang aton mga kabugtuan sa amo kadiang nga mga sitwasyon, bangod man sa aton nga mga historical injustices nga nagkaratabo, no, bangod man kung lang tawon natin sa aton history, ang aton nga mga IPs nangin biktima ka mga injustices nga nagtulod nga agod hindi pag-akoon ang anda nga pagka-IP. Pero sa tlad, no, kinasinggitan gid natin ang aton nga pagka-tumanda kag ang aton nga pagka-IP, bangod na batyaga natin that we are now more empowered as compared before. If one of the parents of the learner is an IP and the other is not, is the child an IP? The answer is yes. The learner is considered an IP for as long as the learner has IP ancestry on the either side of his or her parentage. The learner is considered an IP. Bisan nanay lang o kung tatay lang, no? bisan sa isa lang ka side mo ang IP, automatically IP ikaw. Kag wala mat nagahambal kung up to what degree. So wala that layi nga nagahambal nga kung inapo kag inapuron ikaw sa todo kon sa ingay-ingay indi ikaw IP. As long as nagapanalaitay sa imong kaugatan ang pagka-IP, kang imo IP nga kamalaman, IP ikaw sa gihapon. If the learner does not know that he or she is an IP, what shall we do? Teachers, we are going to discuss with the parents and recognize elders or leaders of the community to which or to whom the learner belongs. Kinahanglan gid nga ma-discuss natin dyan sa aton nga mga tawo sa community. If the learner denies being an IP but community knowledge affirms that the learner is an IP, will the learner be recorded as an IP? The answer is yes. Kay ang bata, na mo may confusion, data na kag hindi natin tanama sarigan gid nga ti kilalahan. That is why we advocate gani ang IPEd agud ma-reconnect sanda sa anda nga culture kag sa anda community. Kag ang makahambal gid the primary source nga sanda IP ang aton learner IP are the parents and the community leaders or people in the community. If the learner belongs to an IP group as ascertained by parents and or the community the learner belongs to, but the learner does not know the community's language and cultural practices, will the learner be recorded as an IP? Yes, the learner will be recorded as an IP, and it is our role again to revitalize the recognition of there being an IP through programs and activities through IPEd program implementation. Agod mapasanyog kag mapapagsik natin kag mapa-reconnect natin sanda nga roots kag pinakauna sa tanan that they should be proud of their own roots and identity. Kaya mo raga tulod ko nanda kon ginakahuya nanda nga culture kag anda nga roots more or less hindi nanda pagbatuno ng anda nga pagka-IP. But if they have the opportunity, if they feel that they are empowered sa anda nga pagka-IP through IPEd program implementation, then we would expect ang anda nga engagement kag participation sa aton nga programs, especially sa aton nga classes, no. In this time of the pandemic, kinahanglan naton nga mag-provide kang mga alternative delivery modalities that cater to our IP learners. Kay balaan natin nga amo gid siyang makabulig kananda, and that is the very core of our IPEd program implementation, for us to say that IPEd continues, that IPEd program implementation continues even in this time of the pandemic. And to sum up what I have shared with you this morning is that it is always safe for us to ask questions. If we are in doubt, our colleagues, our trained co-teachers are there to help us to clarify things on IPEd implementation and our being an IP. Of course, reading is very important. I presented to you, I shared with you the different issuances. All we have to do is to review and revisit and study these issuances so that we could effectively implement the program. We have also the community, which is always our partner in the implementation of the Indigenous Peoples Education Program. And it's always a challenge for us to relearn our own culture, our own ancestry, our own roots, so that we could something to share to our students, and we could consider ourselves as insiders and not as outsiders. We need to help one another because in IPEd, walang maiiwan. So sa ating mga guro, dapat walang bibitiw, sulong ido kalidad. Mayad ayad gid nga aga sa liwat.